Hi, and welcome to ProfDale's Property Video number 28. I'm your host, Dale Whitman. In this video, we're going to cover lease termination and tenant abandonment. Now, obviously, most leases end naturally. They reach the end of their terms, they expire, and that's the end of them. Nothing surprising there. But in this video, we're going to talk about ways that a lease can end prematurely, that is, before its stated term has ended. One way that a lease can end prematurely is because the parties agree to make it end. We might call that termination by mutual agreement. And there are a couple of different ways it can happen: release and surrender. First, let's take a look at release. The landlord has a lease with the tenant. That means the landlord holds the rents and reversion interests. Well, suppose the landlord transfers the rents and reversion interests to the tenant. We call that a release. And now the tenant has all of the interests in the land. So by virtue of the concept of merger, the tenant now has a fee simple absolute, and that of course is the end of the lease. By the way, don't be afraid of the concept of merger. It simply means that one person has acquired all of the interests in the land, maybe from several different sources, but when they have all of the interests, they have, by definition, a fee simple absolute. Now let's take a look at the way surrender works. Essentially, it's in exactly the opposite direction. So here the landlord has a lease with the tenant, and the tenant transfers the leasehold estate to the landlord. We call that transaction a surrender. And again, by merger, this time the landlord now has a fee simple absolute because the landlord has all of the interests in the land. The rents and reversion interest that the landlord had before, and now the tenant's leasehold interest as well. By the way, you'll notice that in both of these transactions, if there is more than 1 year left to go on the lease, the statute of frauds applies. So it's very, very wise of the parties to use a writing for either a release or a surrender. Most often with a release, the parties remember to do that. With a surrender, sometimes they forget and try to do it orally, and that's a big problem. Now we're going to consider what happens when a tenant wants out of the lease but can't get the agreement of the landlord to release the tenant, and therefore the tenant simply abandons the property. They load up the old U-Haul truck and drive down the freeway and are never seen again. That's a tenant abandonment. And the law treats the tenant's abandonment as conduct that is the equivalent of an offer to surrender the leasehold estate to the landlord. Now, it's only an offer to surrender, and obviously an offer isn't effective unless it is accepted by the landlord. So how might a landlord accept the tenant's offer of surrender that's made by the tenant abandoning the property? Well, there are a couple of ways. One way, of course, is the landlord might give an oral or a written statement to the tenant that the tenant's surrender is being accepted. That certainly can happen. But the other way that a landlord might accept an offer of surrender is by simply taking possession of the property for the landlord's own account. That is, the landlord takes possession and exercises complete dominion and control. Will probably go out and try to find another tenant, and that indicates that the landlord no longer expects to hold the old tenant on the lease. Notice that no writing is required in these cases of tenant abandonment because the offer of surrender is being made by conduct rather than by words. Likewise, the landlord can accept that offer by the landlord's conduct. Let's be just a little more rigorous in considering the landlord's legal choices when a tenant abandons the property. What we're going to present on this slide are the standard and traditional landlord's choices. As we'll see in a few minutes, the law is changing in this area, and one of those choices is disappearing. But for the present, let's look at the traditional choices. The first one, as we've already said, is for the landlord to accept the abandonment as a surrender. That terminates the lease. It terminates the tenant's obligation to pay any additional rent. Now the property is all entirely back in the landlord's hands. A second choice is that the landlord might re-enter and take possession, but they might relet the property, that is, find a new tenant, but do so for the old tenant's account, so that any rent collected from the new tenant will offset the old tenant's liability, but the old tenant will continue to be liable for any deficiency in the rent that a new tenant doesn't pay. This also means that if it takes some time for the landlord to find a new tenant, the old tenant will continue to be liable for the full rent during that period. So that's the second choice the landlord has. The third choice, this is the one that's fading away now in the case law, is the landlord can do nothing at all. That means that the old lease remains in effect, the old tenant is still liable, and the old tenant can be sued for the full additional rent as it accrues. This may seem a little wasteful to you to think about the property being left vacant and having a lawsuit to be conducted with its expense and time on top of that waste, but nevertheless, that was originally the majority view and remains the view in quite a few states even today. Now you can easily see that a potential ambiguity can arise when the landlord retakes possession after the tenant abandons and the landlord puts a new tenant in the property. If the landlord retakes possession, is the landlord's entry going to be considered an acceptance of the tenant's offer of surrender? In other words, is the landlord taking possession for his own account or for the tenant's account? Well, many times it's not very clear which the landlord intends. In fact, the landlord may not have any clear intent on the point. So what would a smart landlord do to avoid the construction that the landlord's taking possession for his own account? Well, the answer, of course, is the landlord would send a clear notice to the tenant stating what the landlord's intention is. If the landlord wants to take possession for the tenant's account and hold the tenant liable for any deficiency, the landlord can clearly say so, and that will establish the landlord's position. Now, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, choice number 3 in our little list of 3 choices for the landlord is being withdrawn by the courts. Increasingly, they are holding the landlord cannot simply leave the property vacant and sue the old tenant for the full rent. There's certainly a trend toward not allowing the landlord to do that. This trend is now the majority view for residential tenancies in the United States and a substantial minority view for commercial tenancies. The courts have been a little more reluctant to adopt this new view for commercial tenancies, feeling that commercial tenants can look out better for themselves. The trend is often called a duty to mitigate damages, but that phrase can be quite confusing because this isn't a true duty. In other words, the landlord can't be sued if the landlord fails to mitigate damages, fails to try to find a new tenant. Instead, what we mean by this duty to mitigate damages is simply that if the landlord does not make a reasonable effort to mitigate, that is, put the property back on the market, try to find a new tenant, and give the old tenant credit for the rent the new tenant pays. If the landlord does not make a reasonable effort to do that, the courts will treat the landlord as if he or she had done so. And what that means is the landlord has to credit the tenant with the amount the landlord could have received by making reasonable efforts to mitigate. Even if the landlord made no effort at all, the landlord will still have to give the old tenant credit for the amount the landlord could have earned if the landlord had tried to find a new tenant and made a reasonable effort to do so. Is imposing this duty on the landlord to mitigate damages a good idea? Well, it is quite appealing. It seems much more fair to tenants because they don't have to pay the full rent while the property is sitting there vacant, as in the old law. It also encourages economic use of the premises and thereby reduces the cost to society of having vacant properties with the attendant waste and potential for vandalism and destruction of those properties. On the other hand, there are some disadvantages of this duty to mitigate as well. First of all, the court has to evaluate the landlord's efforts. Were they reasonable efforts? Did the landlord really try hard enough to find a new tenant? Second, the court has to evaluate the results of the landlord's efforts. When the landlord finds a new tenant, is the new rent being paid a fair rent? Is it a market rent? Those things have to take up the court's time and effort to decide. Real estate is different from other commodities in these respects because every parcel of real estate is unique. Every parcel's fair rental value is differently because every parcel's in a different location and has different characteristics, and therefore it's clearly on a case-by-case basis that the court has to evaluate the landlord's efforts and the rent that the landlord is getting from a new tenant. That takes court time and expense, and that's the downside of the duty to mitigate damages. Now, we've said that if the landlord makes an effort to mitigate, but the new tenant doesn't pay as high a rent as the old tenant was liable for, possibly because rental values have dropped, then the old tenant remains liable for the difference. The landlord can also recover a couple of other factors if they're present on the facts. One of them is, suppose the landlord puts the property back on the market and it sits vacant despite the landlord's reasonable efforts for a period of time. Well, the landlord can recover from the old tenant the full rent for that period of vacancy. Now, that assumes that the landlord was making a reasonable effort to relet during that period. In addition, the landlord can recover the expenses of reletting, because if the old tenant hadn't abandoned, the landlord wouldn't have incurred those expenses. That might include things like advertising costs for the property, and if the property is commercial and is listed with a real estate broker, then the landlord can recover the brokerage commissions from the old tenant. Let's look at an example of tenant abandonment and landlord mitigation. We'll assume that the tenant has 1 year remaining on the lease when the tenant abandons the property. The contract rent, the rent the old tenant agreed to pay, is $500 a month. However, the property has dropped a bit in value and its fair rental value is now only $450 a month. The landlord advertises the property for lease. The landlord spends $50 on advertising cost, and it takes 3 months to find a new tenant, but after 3 months, T2, the new tenant, agrees to rent for $450 a month. Now, how does this add up in terms of the old tenant's liability? First of all, the landlord can recover from the old tenant $500 a month for the 3-month period that the property was vacant while the landlord was trying to find a new tenant but hadn't succeeded in finding one yet. So that's $1,500. In addition, the landlord can recover the $50 of advertising expense, and for the remaining 9 months of the lease, the period of time that the new tenant is in the property but paying less rent than the old tenant was liable for, that's $50 a month times 9 months, or $450. So the net liability of the old tenant on these facts would be $2,000. Now let's change the facts and assume that the landlord actually made no attempt at all to relet the property, just let it sit there vacant. What are the landlord's claims against the old tenant? Well, the landlord can still claim the $50 a month deficiency for the full 12 months remaining on the lease. So that would be $600 a month. However, the landlord probably will not be able to recover anything for the vacancy period, because after all, it was the landlord's fault it was vacant. The landlord was making no effort to relet, and the landlord won't be able to recover any reletting expenses because the landlord didn't incur any reletting expenses. Now, the bottom line is that it's very smart for landlords in mitigation states to attempt to relet. If they don't, they're taking a huge hit potentially in how much money they can recover from the old tenant. Notice, however, that all this depends on the assumption that the old tenant is actually available and not judgment proof. If the old tenant is bankrupt or the old tenant has disappeared, so that there's no real hope for the landlord to collect anything from the old tenant, then the landlord may not care about any of this and may or may not try to mitigate. There's really no downside in failing to do so. Here are a couple of questions. What if the landlord relets for substantially less than the fair market rent? Is the original tenant liable for the difference? Well, I think the proper answer to that question is that the original tenant is liable for the difference between the contract rent that the old tenant agreed to pay and the current fair market rent. If the landlord relet at a bargain rent less than current fair rental value, then the landlord will have to suffer that difference. What if the landlord relets for substantially more than the original rent? Perhaps market values have gone up and the landlord can get more rent than the original tenant agreed to pay. Does the original tenant get the overage? There have been a few cases in which the tenant has claimed that, but in every single one of them the court has said, no, tenant, once you abandon the property, you've given up all of your claim to any additional rent that the landlord might collect. so the landlord can keep that overage in the rent. What if the landlord attempts to relet for more than the original rent, but fails to find a tenant? Well, the question again is, did the landlord attempt to relet reasonably, that is, for a fair market rent? Now, obviously, the amount of a fair market rent can be, to some degree, a matter of opinion, and the trier of fact will have to decide that if the case gets litigated. But the landlord's responsibility is to relet for a fair market rent, not for an additional amount that the landlord might, in his fondest dreams, think the property is worth. Here are a few more questions about mitigation. First, can the landlord collect the tenant's liability before it accrues? In other words, the landlord might say, well, there are a number of years left to go on the tenant's lease and the tenant is abandoned. That certainly indicates the tenant has no intention of paying any of that future rent, so I ought to be able to go ahead and collect all of my damages from the old tenant right now. The contract theory of anticipatory breach seems to fit this quite well, and the courts generally have been willing to do so. They've been willing to let the landlord sue and recover once for the full stream of damages instead of having to sue again and again and again for damages that have already accrued. However, how do we calculate that damages? Do we simply add up the monthly rental differential for all of the months and years in the future that the tenant won't be in the property? Well, the problem with that is that because we're collecting the money right now, it would be unreasonable to collect the full sum. What we need to allow the landlord to recover is what we call the present value of the future stream of damages. In other words, an amount that, when invested at some reasonable interest rate, would give the landlord the stream of damages the landlord is entitled to. How far in the future should that recovery extend? In one very well-known case in the Eighth Circuit, the court was faced with a lease that had more than 60 years to go when the tenant abandoned. The court was very, very uncomfortable with the idea of estimating what the fair rental value of the property would be 60 years in the future. So the court made a kind of arbitrary choice and said, we'll give the landlord recovery for 10 years. It turns out that it doesn't make very much difference. That is, the future streams beyond 10 years have relatively little present value and add very little to the landlord's recovery. So the landlord really isn't losing very much if we were to cut off the landlord's liability at 10 years of future damages. Suppose the landlord has multiple vacancies. Which one does he or she show first? The landlord obviously has a temptation to show vacancies that are not those vacated by abandoning tenants, because the landlord has an opportunity to sue them for the rent that's missing. So the landlord might try to steer new tenants away from those vacancies. However, the courts have generally said the landlord has to be even-handed, that the landlord has to show all of the vacant properties, those that were vacated by abandoning tenants and those that were not, in basically an even-handed and straightforward way, and let the new tenant decide which one the tenant wants to rent. Let's assume that you're a tenant in a state that requires mitigation by the landlord, and you want to abandon the property. Perhaps you need to move, you've been transferred, your job has changed, and so you need to get out of your lease. What's the best way to avoid liability for the landlord's potential loss? Well, the best way, without any doubt, is to find a new tenant yourself, one that will pay the full rent that you were paying, present that new tenant to the landlord and say, landlord, look, here's your opportunity to mitigate. Just substitute this new tenant for me, and you won't have any loss at all, and I won't have any liability. Now, the landlord may or may not agree with that, but if the landlord refuses the offer of the new tenant that you found, then the landlord has rejected an obvious opportunity to mitigate damages, and the court is not likely to be sympathetic to the landlord's claim back against you for any additional rent. Well, that wraps up video 28 on lease termination and tenant abandonment. In our next video, number 29, we'll talk about the Federal Fair Housing Act. If you have questions or comments, email ProfDale01@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.